chapter, we deviated from our various students at UA and would instead be focused on the likes of All Might. We'd open up to All Might on a drive by his lonesome as he reflected on his vow to protect Deku and his subsequent failure to keep up and do so. When he made his way to the statued visage of his former self, he couldn't help being a bit self-deprecating. He felt like a burden more than anything else at this point, going as far as to express as much verbally, a slight at the former #1 hero that the hero killer Stain would not allow to pass as he raised his weathered katana towards All Might suddenly. Stain would demand a retraction of such words, yet All Might wouldn't so much as flinch at the sight of the fiend. Now, with his confrontation, All Might would firstly be under the presumption that Stain had not recognized him to be All Might at all, as he would continually rebuke such a claim. Even after seeing All Might in his muscular state, Stain refused as such. And that's because to Stain, All Might was a hero and the man before him was simply pitiful. It's not that he didn't recognize him to be All Might at all, but rather the man before him was more Toshinori. In response, All Might would recount his reasoning for having become a hero at all, an utter disapproval of the turmoil perpetuated by villainy that was so strong that, very much like Deku, he was moving against it before he could even realize as such, an innate desire to alleviate the pain and struggles of others. However, at this point he simply felt washed up, that the path he had gone along had ultimately concluded here, feeling more and more estranged from the concept of heroism. And just then, Stain would abruptly pull All Might aside, yet had absolutely no bloodlust to be felt. Meanwhile, a woman from a nearby shelter would make her way over to the All Might statue and begin to clean it up. This woman then being revealed by Stain to have been the last person saved by All Might, a woman protected by All Might in the midst of his final battle against the dastardly All for One. Stain would then grip firmly onto the form of All Might and make it abundantly clear that even in the worst of times, All Might would maintain a smile and fight tirelessly for the people. That such a thing had nothing to do with powers or quirks. Despite his words, All Might's influence lives on to this day. That true heroism has not been extinguished, a sentiment which brought tears to All Might's eyes. Stain would then allude to having seen Deku depart from All Might and would begin to take his leave after having provided All Might with some peculiar intel he had gathered from his time in Tartarus, only to then tell All Might that once he's done with it, he will need to come after Stain, the killer of 40 heroes, all for the sake of society, just as Rain finally let up. A shift is coming. With this latest chapter, we'd certainly get a shift, as the mood was entirely different as the boys of Class 1A prepared a bath for Deku. The water was hot for this community bath as a bunch of these guys hauled Deku over like dirty laundry, took off his tattered costume, and absolutely power washed him, only to then jump in themselves. A very peculiar series of events, as I did not expect to see something like this at all. From there, we'd also receive Bakugo reprimanding them all for the mess. And to this, Tokoyami would bring up the fact that despite apologizing, Bakugo hasn't exactly changed, as Sato would chime in by telling him to chill out for once, as Bakugo would very suddenly jump into the bath as well. Now with an intense look on his face, he would lower his head down towards the water and declare that he still intends to become the #1 hero and that they are all still his rivals. Then being quite the tsundere, as he would express that this included Deku as well. Although as he began to say Deku, he would actually correct himself to say Izuku instead. And I must say that once these contents eventually get animated, it is going to be very weird to hear him say the guy's actual name for a change. And as he looked at Deku, he splashed him in the face with water, which I felt was a nice touch, a subtle one, but a nice touch nonetheless. In the previous panel, you can see that Deku was for the most part only half changed by the water, only to then be blasted and equalized by Bakugo, who I imagine is having a very hard time being forward towards Deku here emotionally. And so to offset the difference, there is still a physical outburst to be observed, albeit not a violent or malicious one. Forceful perhaps, but still in his best interest. One of the guys would then tell Bakugo that Deku's being taken care of, so if this is out of his comfort zone, he doesn't need to force himself, as Bakugo would rebut that he wasn't forcing himself, and with that, Deku was now properly back at UA. Now immediately after getting cleaned up, Deku would seek out Uraraka, however she had actually fallen asleep following all the previous commotion. Now if you look, it seems like Uraraka does sleep wearing gloves, which I think is pretty interesting. I imagine unconsciously causing things to float in your sleep might be a bit troublesome. And speaking of troublesome, Deku would apologize for all the trouble he had caused his classmates. From there, Mina would then ask for a bit of clarification in regards to One for All. Ojiro would begin to consider what it must have been like to have gone from being quirkless to so incredibly powerful just like that, as Sero would then bring up the fact that it used to destroy his body. But before Deku could really answer anyone, Shoto would appear as he dried his hair and say that Deku was liable to be even more tired than any of them, and so they should let him rest, as frankly that is the whole reason they brought him back in the first place. However, Deku would make it clear that he was having trouble sleeping at the moment, and this was because his departure from All Might was weighing quite heavily on him at the moment, that he would not be able to sleep until he has properly apologized, yet could not seem to get into touch with him, just as Shoto would point to All Might creeping through the window. We would then swiftly cut to All Might apologizing as well. Mina too would demand an apology be made to all of them as well, as he had left them rather suddenly. To this, All Might would express that everything would be coming together soon, much to Mina's confusion, just before apologizing to all of them. But although he couldn't get into the details, he had in fact gathered some new information, and so the answer would become clear relatively soon. And internally, his mind was made up. He would continue to fight regardless of how bad things may get, as he intended to see the fruition of their efforts for himself. He would then begin to express that there's not much he can currently do with his body, just before being cut off by Deku, who would express his gratitude for the meals All Might had previously prepared for him, admitting that he likely only got as bad as he did because the two were not together, and so he wanted to change that so that they would be able to protect everyone, which brought a smile to All Might's face, as he was absolutely intent on keeping up with all of them, which is oh so interesting to me. I'm really not sure what All Might be able to bring to the table beyond something like a noble sacrifice, to be honest with you. All Might has been throwing up death flags for ages now at this point, and with this new path of his being as dangerous as it is, it only feels that much more plausible. But from there, All Might would make his departure, as he needed to see Endeavor and the other heroes, and as he left, Tokoyami would ask him to tell Hawk to at least text him, as he was in fact worried. Sato would question if they were planning on coming to UA or not, but as said by Shoto, given the situation and additional Dabi fallout, they weren't exactly welcomed by the public with open arms, although there are still some evacuees who respect him regardless. An interesting prospect for sure, but during this banter, Deku actually managed to fall asleep. Shoto would then throw a blanket over Deku, as he would say that Deku is probably still worried about him as Dabi's brother and Endeavor's son, a sentiment which clearly bothered Kirishima, as to him, it was unfair for Shoto to have to go through something like this on account of his family circumstances. However, Shoto did actually feel responsible for a bit of the blame, as he was so hyperfixated on his own problems that he lost himself. But according to him, he was different now and ready to prove it to everyone, that he wouldn't let them worry about him anymore. For me, the Todoroki family drama is the best subplot in the series, so it is really great to see the emotional growth of Shoto on full display. People tend to bring up Bakugo's development a whole lot these days, but let us not overlook just how far Shoto has gone with his changes, an evolution that even Kirishima was moved by. But getting back to the sentiment that some of the evacuees respect Endeavor regardless, Jiro would think to herself and bring it up to the others before grabbing hold of a few of them with her earlobes. The situation seemed to remind her of the cultural festival and the surrounding stigma around their class, and as such, for the sake of easing the worries of the people and returning these smiles to their faces, they would think of what more they can do, giving it their all and doing their absolute best. From here, they plan to move ever forwards and become better versions of themselves to go beyond plus ultra. Now elsewhere, we would have the recounting of information by the likes of Hawks the Best Genist as they were on a drive, compiling the statements of the now apprehended Dr. Garaki in relation to their understanding of the Nomu and such. From their deductions, Shigaraki would at the very least require 2 months to build up towards perfection. With this being said, they had approximately 1 month of time to make the first move on All for One and Shigaraki. Or at least, that's what they thought, as what Stain had actually provided to All Might were records from a guard of Tartarus, a letter solely intended to be read by All Might with no intention of sharing said information to others. A helpful prospect from the hero killer that Endeavor never expected to be the case, and that was the chapter. I must say that it is really nice to see all of these characters reunited and with such strong convictions. To now officially know how much time the heroes likely have to stop Shigaraki before he's at his absolute best is pretty cool, and I'm really curious what sort of information a Tartarus guard might have had access to. Something related to All for One that may have the ability to shift the tide. Information that was enough for the pro heroes to reroute their approach here. Whatever information Stain has provided here, it is clearly huge, and I am very much looking forward to seeing what all the hoopla is about. My Hero Academia, even despite a chapter like this, does have an air of finality about it for me. In the sense of literal time for us, sure, we likely have some years left with the manga, however canonically it's almost like we're packing our bags up here and addressing all that we can for the sake of a conclusive end that is somewhat in view. There is perhaps a bit of sadness to be found in that, but even more so, there is just so much to be excited about. And you know what, we are just really glad to have the opportunity to discuss these chapters with all of you yet again. Regardless of whatever situation may be thrown our way, so long as we have all of you, the plot army, we are strong and will continue to rise again and again. In the comments, let us know how you feel about this more lighthearted and wholesome chapter after all the doom, gloom, and seriousness we have experienced prior. Your support is especially appreciated right now because with such a sudden absence, we don't want the algorithm to think that the war is over. And seeing as we are so close to